I don't want to do a disservice to Hegel. And I want to try to convey the importance of the power of rationality and refutation as it is pit against emotionalism or irrationalism that tries to dismiss it. Now, a critique of Hegel from his Science of Logic. This is the A.V. Miller translation. Now, the foundation of Hegel's logic falls into error. It falls into a performative contradiction. I have not seen Hegel be able to work his way out of this performative contradiction. Instead, I see deep confusion within Hegel's articulation. Now, that being said, we are indebted to Hegel because Hegel has so powerfully criticized the foundational laws of logic that once they survive his critique, they emerge with 100-fold authority from what they had before. As far as I know, Hegel's attempt at, I will say, refuting the laws of logic, he might use the word sublating them, he might use the word of eminently critiquing them, of qualifying them, of dialectically correcting them. These are terms maybe Hegel would use or Hegelians would use when discussing what Hegel is doing in the process of critiquing these laws. Now, I'm going to just point to two errors, fatal errors, when Hegel goes to critique identity in the section on essence. He says, the truth is rather that a consideration of everything that is shows that in its own self, everything is in its self-sameness different from itself and self-contradictory. And that in its difference, in its contradiction, it is self-identical and is in its own self this movement of transition of one of these categories into the other, and for this reason, that each is in its own self the opposite of itself. This is a violation of the law of non-contradiction. It's a violation of the principle of identity. It is impossible to articulate this position without assuming and utilizing stable identities throughout the process of the sentence. You cannot do it. It is impossible. Everything that is, when Hegel says, must refer to everything. It has to have a stable identity. When he says that in its contradiction, it is self-identical and is in its own self this movement of transition of one of these categories into the other, and for this reason, that which it is in its own self, the opposite of itself. This would annihilate identity. It would destroy it. This is not impossible. This is impossible. Hegel is saying that A is also non-A. That's not possible. You would not be able to state a meaningful sentence. Your identity would collapse. He says, identity, therefore, is in its own self absolute non-identity. This is false. This is completely impossible, once again. This is a fallacy. Hegel is here. He has two static identities, identity and non-identity, and then he says that these are the same. This is not possible. But it is also the determination of identity as against non-identity, for as reflection into itself, it posits itself. Hegel is confused. This is what happens when you try to negate or bypass the laws of logic. You end up in confusion making statements like this, saying things like identity is in its own self absolute non-identity. That's nonsense. It can't be that. Otherwise, it would self-destruct. We would not be able to maintain static. This sentence would not be possible, because when you say identity in the beginning is in its own self absolute non-identity, you would be saying non-identity is in its own self absolute identity. You'd be saying the opposite of the very thing that you're saying. But clearly, Hegel doesn't mean the opposite of the thing he is saying. So this is not possible for him to make this statement. There is massive error in Hegel here, but Hegel, he was a genius. There's no doubt about it. And so by taking him at his word, by criticizing his critique of the laws of logic, we simply find out how much more powerful they are, and he ends up reinforcing them at a very high level, the highest level, because I think his attack and critique on them is probably the most sophisticated attack and critique on these laws that has ever been articulated against them. So when you see identity and the law of non-contradiction and the laws of logic overcome these critiques, you simply reinforce how powerful they are, how necessary they are, how irrefutable they are. Now, I want to make a very important point here, because this annoys me. When you deal with irrationalists and emotivists, when you deal with postmodern ironists, when you deal with modern-day sophists, and you demonstrate a refutation like this refutation of Hegel is not my opinion. What I stated is mathematically provable. When he says identity and non-identity are the same, this is impossible. If that was the case, then the symbol of A and non-A would be meaningless, because you could not identify A as A, you could not identify non-A as non-A. It would be a meaningless. It's called self-refuting. So it's not my opinion that this is a refutation. This is a logical refutation of itself. What upsets me about sophists is that we can show them this. We can demonstrate the syllogism with mathematical precision, and they will dismiss it on the basis of emotion. This is the way that modern sophists work, because they do not know how to reason. They do not know how to think. So when they see a refutation, they do not engage it. They're not going to engage the argument or the refutation I just put forth of Hegel. They're going to negatively characterize it, frame it with derogatory terms, and then dismiss it. That's not the way rationality works. That's not the way reason works. That is the way sophistry works. That's the way irrationalism works. That's the way emotivism works. But there are a good many sophists and irrationalists in the world. And what they do is they try to bully. So this point that we've made about Hegel's statements being self-refuting, evidently self-refuting, the sophist wants to simply dismiss this and say, well, who cares? This doesn't matter. Yes, it does matter, because Hegel is using the laws of logic to state his point, to justify, to make his point intelligible. He's using these laws. So if these laws don't matter, then his point doesn't matter. Everything just collapses into a jumble of static noise. Everything collapses into meaninglessness. It loses its intelligibility if the laws of logic are removed from it. It becomes an emotional, a kind of performance, an act of intimidation, because one is not making their point through reason. They're not rationally pushing their point and making their case. They're intimidating, they're dismissing, they're using rhetoric, they're using every single emotional technique in the book because they don't like the conclusion that Hegel is in error here, that his position is a violation, that it self-destructs because it has to use the very laws that it claims to bypass in order to make its case. Every logic has to do that. So these sophists that try to do this, we need to not be moved by them. All they can do is dismiss. They cannot reason. They do not have this capacity, and we need to point this out to them. You are not making an argument. You are not engaging with the argument. You are not refuting the refutation. You are simply dismissing it, which is rationally incompetent. This needs to be pointed out because sophistry is alive and well, and because people default to it when they don't like conclusions. And the philosophy of our time has specialized in this narrative, emotive, dismissing project. These are not reasoners. These are not thinkers even. These are emotive dogmatists who are looking for narratives that they like, that validate them, that give them a feeling of power, authority, and then they are trying to safeguard these narratives by not allowing them to be subject to evidence or reason. And they do this by dismissing, by attacking, by engaging in all kinds of fallacies. So this refutation is demonstrated here with Hegel at the most crucial point in his logic. A sophist wants to simply dismiss it, as they want to dismiss everything that functions this way, because they cannot refute it. And so the point is to constantly be exposing this emotivism, calling it out for what it is. It is a betrayal of the very methods that these people have to make use of to even make a single solitary point. They cannot make a single intelligible sentence if they do not make use of the laws of logic. And to then turn around and dismiss valid arguments based on those laws is to self-refute your own position. Now, these sophists do not care because they're looking for narratives. So at the end of the day, we can manifest their refutation and their error all day long. They will retreat into apathy. They will retreat into indifference. But here is the crucial point. Thinkers who do that, even though they don't realize it, they have destroyed the power of their thought. They don't realize they've done this. They have literally destroyed the power of their position. While they think they are manifesting a deepity, in the case here with Hegel, the sophist will say something like, well, you don't understand. It's much deeper than that. That's fine. Then articulate the depth. Put it into a propositional form. Clarify it for us. They're not going to do that because they're appealing to a deepity, which is a form of emotivism or mysticism, because they can't refute the logic. They can't refute the argument. And so they retreat into this idea that there's something deeper there that you're missing. That's fine. Always remain open to this. But just saying it's deeper without manifesting it is like appealing to theology or some mystical concept of God. These thinkers, while they think that they are swimming in the deep, they are actually deceiving themselves. They are living in delusion and they are not aware of it. What they really manifest when they say things like this and when they manifest dismissal and indifference and apathy to legitimate, valid refutations of positions, they are simply manifesting their limit as thinkers. That's the capacity as far as they can possibly go. It does not appear this way to them because they're functioning by mystical narratives. But the truth is, they have actually manifested their depth, the point to which they cannot go. And the danger of this is that if we become captivated by our own emotional, authoritarian narratives, our own mysticism in this way, we will sabotage ourselves as thinkers. Do not do this. Follow reason. Follow evidence, even if it refutes the things that you love. Because if you do not do that, you will destroy yourself as a thinker and you will not even know it. This is what I see from thinkers who are very well read, but do not have the capacity to reason. I see it over and over again. They pivot, they posture to this idea of depth that they do not articulate, that they do not defend, and they constantly dismiss premises that they don't like. They are limited as thinkers. And above all, we have to be on guard. We have to be cautious so that we do not fall into this ourselves. Because, as Richard Feynman said, there's no one easier to fool than ourselves. We are the easiest people to fool. And the loss is that we will not be capable, our thought will not be capable of truly flowing into the depth. It will not be capable of comprehending at a high level. It will not be capable of clarity. All these things will be missing. We will become confused, like I believe Hegel becomes confused, because he doesn't understand that there's two different identities going on there that he's trying to conflate into one fallaciously. He cannot do it, but he confuses himself because he thinks he's at this deeper layer of contradiction, this magical, mystical layer where these things are brought together in a unity. They're not. Their identity remains different. Otherwise, you can't make sense of either one. Beware of falling in and becoming this kind of thinker, and don't be intimidated by thinkers who posture down that path. Hold your line on refutation. Hold your line on logic. Hold your line on evidence. They are the ones with the problem. If evidence is on the side of the position that we advocate, and the arguments are on the side of the position that we are putting forth, and people do not want to accept that because they emotionally don't like it, that is their problem. That is their loss. That is their incompetence.